and they were able to seek shelter in places like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and a lot of them then came back after the war ended, seeking not to live in their former communities in Poland and elsewhere where they felt unwelcome frequently, and they made their ways to these DP camps. We should recall that there was a certain amount of friction between the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and the indigenous populations. There were concerns about, recriminations. There were concerns about compensation because frequently the property of Jews was simply seized by neighbors, in some cases by the official governing authorities. And there were concerns that perhaps the Jews would, seek to reclaim their property. In some cases, like in Kielce in Poland, incredibly, there was actually a blood libel that resulted in a massive riot in 1946, and it sent a very clear message that Jews are no longer welcome here. And so, Jews, by and large, were not comfortable returning to homes that had been destroyed by the Holocaust, in particular communities destroyed by the Holocaust. Less so to the further east regions of European Russia, because of the Soviet Union more properly, because those were generally less destroyed than in central Poland. But, have a look at this map here. The DP camps were scattered throughout this region. They were designed to be temporary. Most of them were closed down by 1952. And they were really intended to be sort of transition camps where people would move on to new places. Many of them housed primarily non-Jews, but several of them, Feldafing, for example, were especially associated with Jews and actually had, separate facilities for Jews. Ironically, many of them were set up in former Nazi concentration camps, which was rather jarring, as we shall see here. I should mention offhand, by the way, I have a special connection to the DP camps through my father, Olav Shalom, that my grandparents living in northern Canada took in an orphan who was in one of these DP camps. They brought him to Canada, and he was the same age as my father, about 15 at the end of the war, and they were raised together. So my father had a special connection with European Jewry in that regard, and he often spoke about it. At any rate, so there's the DP camps. Now, what was life like there? One of the amazing things that characterizes the Jews returning to the DP camps is a remarkable rush to rebuild. There was a palpable feeling in the Jewish communities that emerged in these strange kind of transitory camps that the Jews were so motivated to rebuild their lives. You have to realize that these people were coming from all different parts of Europe, sometimes not even having common languages, yet the urge to marry and to have families was exceptionally pronounced in the region. Here's a photograph of a wedding occurring in a DP camp. And here's a document that I have to say I find very chilling. This was something I came across when I was working in the YIVO archives, the Yiddische Wissenschaftliche Institute that's located in Manhattan. And it's a marriage contract. And as you can see, it's like Xeroxed or mimeographed, more properly, that and it has blank spaces where the date and the name of the bride, the name of the groom, and things like that can be inserted, and the signatures at the bottom. But at the top of the page, it has a Star of David. That makes sense in a Jewish marriage contract. But the words on either side of it are Bergen-Belsen, the notorious concentration camp that was liberated by the Allies, and it was infamously scattered with emaciated corpses of Jews who had died there. And to think that you would have a ketubah that specifically has the name of this notorious camp on it is just mind-boggling. But even more frightening is this document that I came across, which I think is in so many ways illustrative of what it must have been like for the Jews returning to these DP camps. This is also from the YIVO archives, and it took me a while to figure out what exactly is it that I'm looking at. This is a document that was created for the Jews in the DP camps specifically to deal with husbands whose wives had disappeared in the Holocaust. And they did not know if their wives were alive or dead, their first wives, but presumed dead. But their death could not be confirmed at the threshold credibility to allow the men to otherwise remarry without any complications. So this document here was essentially an assurance by the prospective husband that if his first wife showed up, he would submit to the authority of the court with regards to the disposition of his marriages. Because if his first wife survived the Holocaust, then they would still be married, and he would have been engaged in a rabbinically forbidden marriage to his second wife. And, then they'd have to sort out, well, who is he married to? And who does he divorce in order to maintain the medieval ban, which we discussed a while ago, on polygamy? The fact that this document had to be mass produced through a mimeograph machine and that every husband had to sign it indicates just scope of this otherwise very unusual kind of problem, but something which was unfortunately very common in the war. Even more significant was the situation that women found themselves in this case, if they weren't sure what the status of their husband was during the war. A tremendous amount of energy was devoted by the rabbinical councils set up in the DP camps themselves to try and resolve those doubts so as to allow women to go on with their lives, because there was a tremendous, it's as if the Jews had seen so much death that all they wanted to do in the DP camps was affirm life. And affirm it they did in a very big way. The birth rate of Jewish women in the DP camps was totally off the charts. And literally, I'll give you an example here of the numbers. Here's comparisons of birth per 1,000 women at various points in the war. So it's not an exact matchup always, but you can see that before the war, all women in Germany were having children about the rate of 25.9 per thousand women in 1920. Because birth rate often is affected by the economy and political turmoil and things like that, it had reduced significantly by 1933 when German women, Jewish and non-Jewish, although there was only about 500,000 Jews in Germany at this time, about 1% of the population, so it's not a huge chunk of it, about 14.7 children per 1,000 women. Immediately after the war in Bavaria, which is a region of Germany, you see that all women are having a birth rate at 7.35 children per 1,000 women in 1946, right after the war. Obviously, tremendous upheaval and death and all kinds of things. But if you look at Bavarian Jewish women specifically, in that same study, they're having children 29 per 100,000 29 per 1,000 women, which is like 4 times the rate of non-Jewish women. And if you look at German Jews overall, Jews specifically, the rate is even higher, 35.8 children per 1,000 women. They called these children born immediately after the war Mashiach's Kinder, which means the children of the Messiah. Not literally the children of the Messiah like as the Father, but the children of the Messianic age, meaning that these children born in the immediate post-war era would herald the beginning of the end of time, that somehow this renaissance, literally renaissance, rebirthing, after the hell of the Holocaust would result in ultimately the resolution of everything unjust and the beginnings of the Messianic era. It's an amazing kind of thing to imagine what the mindset of these people must have been like. Marrying people that came from totally different backgrounds, frequently large age gaps, frequently lack of a common language, but nevertheless this shared tremendous drive to rebuild, to create Jewish families, to raise up these Mashiach's Kinder. I find it deeply motivational. This is also an example of life in the camps that's related to their drive not only to rebuild, but to regain, to go back to the study of the Torah and the traditional texts, the Talmud and so on, that were so revered. One of the things that the American Occupation Authority discovered when they were dealing with all these Jews in the DP camps was that they were desperately short of religious reading materials, that they wanted to study Talmud together, and they had no way to do it. The Talmuds were destroyed, burned in the Holocaust of the attacks on the synagogues, all the way from Kristallnacht and so on, and very difficult to acquire. So the American Army generously said, no problem, let's print a new edition of the Talmud. And they printed this edition, which has been known colloquially as the Survivor's Talmud, printed on the very same presses that the Nazis had used for their propaganda. Now they were being used with Hebrew type to reprint the famous Vilna Shas of the 1860s. And have a look at this remarkable cover that just is such an evocative series of images. Here at the bottom, there's a depiction of what appears to be two Jews in a camp. It looks a little bit like Mauthausen, and it appears that they're collecting up bodies to be placed in this cart, a little bit like the way that the Chevra Kadisha in Warsaw had to go around every morning collecting up the corpses that were left in the street and to bring them to mass burial. And the verse at the top of this image reads, it's from Psalms, I was almost destroyed, but I did not forget your commandments. Very motivational verse. At the bottom, it says a labor camp in Ashkenaz in the days of the Nazis. You know, Machane Avoda b'Ashkenaz b'yamei HaNazim. And then you can see surrounding this image, you know, these dark motifs of the barbed wire fences, evocative of the concentration camps, and it's a very dark kind of image, especially jarring to see it on the cover of the Talmud. And here you see, as you move up the page, on either side you have this Middle Eastern kind of motif with the sort of, you know, Middle Eastern architecture and palm trees and flowing brooks, obviously meant to evoke the land of Israel, which we'll talk about shortly. The tractate that I'm showing you here is the first one of the entire Talmud. It's the tractate that deals with blessings, how appropriate. The text here indicates that it was published by the Association of Rabbis in the American DP camps in Ashkenaz, with the help of the American forces in Germany, right? Because the Americans actually put this together using the presses. Phenomenal. And then at the very top of the page, there's this stylized image of Jerusalem, the sun rising, hope anew, and things like that. And it says in the text underneath also a liturgical quote, from slavery to redemption, from darkness to great light, which is obviously the overall message that this Talmud is portraying. At the recent completion of the cycle of Talmudic study called Daf Yomi, that was celebrated around the world in early 2020, they actually used a page from the last volume of this series of the Survivor's Talmud to read the last few lines and conclude the 7.5 learning cycle of the Talmud. A very, very moving experience as tens and tens of thousands of Jews present at MetLife Stadium, like I was, or around the world in other celebrations, listened in on the final conclusion of that cycle of the study of the Talmud before it would immediately begin again. Remarkable testament to the impetus for life after the Holocaust. Now, obviously, this occurs in the ruins demographically of the Jews of Europe. Now, look at these two maps, which come from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. you could certainly see a lot of things, a tremendous change of the time. The map on the left is 1933, meaning a few years before the Holocaust began, or let's say before World War II began for sure. And then on the right, you have in 1950, which is 5 years after the end of the war, but also reflects numbers that show population displacement. So, for example, you see that France in 1933 had 225,000 Jews. They actually went up 10,000 by 1950. That's largely because of the displaced persons making their way west from Eastern Europe. The numbers are really shocking when you see countries like Germany, of course, which goes from 565,000 to 37,000. Poland goes from 3 million to 45,000. A shocking decline in numbers. The Soviet Union loses about 500,000 Jews. It's a little bit hard to get the right calculation because the Soviet Union will absorb the Baltic states and a good chunk of Poland, pre-war Poland as well. But Soviet Union still is the great center of Ashkenazic Jewish demographic weight as you move into the second half of the 20th century. So overall, of course, the famous number of 6 million, which represents about 1/3 of all Jews worldwide, about 2/3 of European Jews, and a very similar number of all Ashkenazi Jews specifically. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Sephardic victims of Nazism, those who were killed, primarily in certain regions in Southern Europe, in Greece, Bulgaria, and of course they were persecuted in North Africa, but the numbers are much smaller there. The huge losses were primarily Ashkenazic in nature. So in this context, we go into the radically changed post-war era, and certainly the most significant phenomenon that affects the lives of Jews, and especially that massive bulk of Ashkenazi Jews who are living in the Soviet Union, is the imposition of the Cold War. This is one of the last photographs right at the very, very beginning of the Cold War that shows representatives of the United States in the center, and the English on the left, or the United Kingdom on the left, and of course the Communist Soviet Union on the right. This is at the Conference of Yalta, I believe, where they essentially, map out what's going to happen to the destroyed Third Reich. And ultimately what ends up happening is the competition between America specifically and the West in general and the Soviet Union rapidly hardens into a standoff, especially when both parties acquire the atomic power and nuclear power, and you develop the eventually what was called this madness, literally madness, the détente affected by the policy of, or the reality of, mutually assured destruction, right? The fact that both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons that they could assuredly destroy the entire globe. Hard to imagine it, but that has been the situation for more than the last half century. And frighteningly enough, with the current war going on in Ukraine, it's not very far from the imaginations of people even today. But under the circumstances of the Cold War, you have what Churchill termed the Iron Curtain that descends over Europe, separating the American-led European West, or American highly influenced European West, and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact countries of East Central Europe and the East that are under Soviet dominance. The experience of Jews behind the Soviet Union was far more negative than it was before World War II. You'll recall that we discussed that brief decade of the 20s when there was a tremendous amount of energy placed in the development of specifically Yiddish culture, although, to the detriment of religious culture, which is always the enemy of the Soviet Union. And in the post-war era, there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism, although it has a slightly different character. Stalin himself, in his later years, reveals his personal animus to Jews, his fear that Jewish doctors were striving to poison him and things like that. And even after he dies in 1953, his successors retain a distinctively anti-Jewish posture that's expressed in many different ways. One of the most notorious of these is the publication in the 1960s of this almost Nazi-like anti-Semitic tract called Judaism Without Embellishment, which is just a ridiculous attack on Judaism on various fronts. And since it can only really be produced with approval of the Soviet state, it seemed pretty clear in the 1960s that anti-Semitism was now official policy of the Soviet Union. Now, that doesn't mean that they were distancing themselves from the 1937 Constitution, which granted, for example, religious rights to Jews of all religions. The Soviet Union, cynically proclaimed that it allowed the freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of expression, but in reality, stepping out of the lines, which were often not stated explicitly, was opening yourself up to a tremendous degree of persecution by the state. If you decided, for example, you wanted to avail yourself of the 1937 freedom to worship, and you decided to show up to synagogue, you were essentially just volunteering your name for the KGB mailing list, and your children could be followed. You could lose your employment in a state which officially proclaimed there was no unemployment, which meant that you were impoverished because no one would be able to hire you. And all kinds of awful things were happening in this what was essentially a totalitarian state that had decided that anti-Semitism was its unwritten but essentially official policy. In the 1960s, you have the burgeoning movement of dissidents against the Soviet Union. I shouldn't say burgeoning, it really had much further roots, but in the 1960s, it began to find a new and very vocal expression. Ironically, this was a time when many nationalities, including the Jews, began to find their common cause against the Soviet Union. Many of the Soviet Jewish dissidents, Soviet Ukrainian dissidents, Latvian, Estonian, Lithuanian, Polish dissidents found themselves together in the penal colonies in Siberia, and they began to realize that they actually had a lot in common. This would become extremely important as these various states are able to finally aggressively push towards their independence in the late 80s and in early 1990s. From the perspective of Jews, the most significant development among Ashkenazim was the so-called refusnik phenomenon, where Jews would seek to emigrate to Israel, and they would, apply for an exit visa, and the Soviet authorities would deny it. And the reasons for this are just so bizarre and complicated. Russian government in particular, over the course of the last 200 years, they exhibited a strange kind of deep-seated insecurity over what the West will think of them. This is part, viewing this lecture in our contemporary moment of that Russian-Ukrainian war, this is part of the reason why, cultural icons in Russia and abroad who criticize Russia have an unusually powerful sting in Russian society. The idea that sports figures could not compete in international competitions because of Russian aggression against Ukraine is frequently quite important. So there was a concern that anytime a person left the Soviet Union dissatisfied with society, that reflected badly on the entire Soviet Union, and therefore they had to be forced to remain in the country. And a whole series of pretexts would be brought to bear to try to justify their refusal. They were so-called refuseniks because they had received the refusal of the exit visa. Sometimes they were not allowed to leave because they were said to possess dangerous state secrets that were vital to the functioning of the state. And one of my own extended family members, for example, was a dentist who was refused exit from the Soviet Union because he possessed dangerous secrets. And what kind of dangerous secrets would this dentist have? So he later discovered that the reason why they tagged it onto him was because in his dissertation for his dental degree, he worked with one particular alloy that was used in fillings, and that particular alloy and its chemical properties was also used apparently in some of the fighter jets that they had made. And so therefore, his familiarity with this particular alloy and its chemical composition was sufficient to deny him exit. He later was able to finally gain exit as the pressure mounted, largely as a result of very strong solidarity with the refuseniks of Jews worldwide. And as you can see here, an American protest for Soviet Jewry, which was really one of the most important elements that brought together Ashkenazi Jews with in the New World with their co-religionists living behind the Iron Curtain, was support for those Jews like Anatoly Sharansky, who were refused exit from the Soviet Union. And this movement ultimately was contributing factor in the pressures that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union, one of many factors. Now, related to all of this, the Ashkenazim behind the Iron Curtain trying to leave, the huge demographic change of World War II, is the incredible phenomenon of the revival of the Jewish state known as Israel. This is like one of the most remarkable stories told in the modern period. And if you look at it, if you were a Martian arriving on this planet and someone told you this, it would be really hard to believe it, that this tiny people, a fraction of 1% of the world's population, would not only survive 2,000 years of diaspora with their cultural identity intact, despite the depredations of both hostile neighbors with anti-Semitism and also the internal dissolution that comes from warm neighbors that results in assimilation, that they would somehow survive 20 centuries of exile and then a persecution that was far beyond anything they had ever experienced before. I mean, think about the scale. 6 million Jews, 2/3 of European Jews being killed. The next closest number of violent acts against Jews would be in the pogroms of Ukraine of 1919 that we discussed a couple days ago, that maybe took 50, 60,000 lives. I mean, horrible tragedies, all of them. And even if we were to take a more liberal estimate of maybe 100,000, 6 million, it's overwhelming. And nevertheless, after this phenomenal attack, they're able to reconstitute themselves as a sovereign state in their ancient homeland. It is truly mind-boggling. And if I had my druthers, we would just stop this lecture right now and contemplate what that must mean, because it is overwhelming. Nevertheless, we're just going to say the words, and we'll leave the meditation for that for a later period. We can add to that the fact that they immediately enter into a war with their neighbors, one of several existential wars that they fight over the course of the next 75 odd years, and they're still there. It is, these things do not conform to the so-called laws of history. They're working in a supernatural realm. We just don't understand it. But focusing on our period specifically, sorry for that kind of like tangential rant, the pressure on the Allies to allow Ashkenazi Jews to immigrate to the land of Israel is profound. You can see here, and this is one of the many ships of Jews who are attempting to enter the land of Israel illegally. At this point, by the way, the land of Israel, called Palestine at that point, a lot of political associations with whether you call it Palestine or Israel. I'm trying to generally avoid those things, but we're talking about the same piece of global real estate. It was originally controlled by the Ottoman Muslims in the beginning of the 20th century. They lost it at the end of World War I, and it was controlled then by the British as a mandate from the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations. This British mandate occupied the interwar period, and then immediately after the war, the British wanted to leave it, just like they had left, for example, the Indian subcontinent. It's happened exactly at the same time, and so it was turned over to the United Nations for a resolution. The United Nations ultimately in 1947 came up with a partition plan that divided the land of Israel into 7 segments, because of course the Jewish immigration and the Arab population there were disputing the territory, and both wanted to claim it. So the UN partition plan divided the area into 7 distinct segments. 3 of them were Jewish, 3 of them were Arab, and Jerusalem was to be an international territory. Didn't work, huge war, and ultimately Israel, the Jewish forces were able to establish a significant portion of the land under their control, although hostilities with their neighbors, of course, would persist for decades thereafter. But the pressure during the time we're looking at right now was intense. The British mandates, the British authorities were very hard-pressed to try and hold these things back, and ultimately they ended up in the announcement of the State of Israel. And this changes everything, because for the first time in 2,000 years, this tiny minority, the Ashkenazim and Jews worldwide, suddenly have a legitimate country of their own. And so there is always this possibility now for Jews. It's totally new. It's a de novo situation in Jewish history where, at least since the Roman era, where the Jews can theoretically return home. This is one of there are several of these massive airlifts. For example, Ethiopian Jews making their way back to Israel in Operation Moses. But the largest and very consequential for the land of Israel was the great airlift of Soviet Jews in the early 1990s. That the pressure building on the Soviet Union to reform itself under Gorbachev, instituting glasnost and perestroika and all kinds of, liberal movements to try and ease the threats to Soviet hegemony. They turned out not to work, and the Soviet Union eventually falls apart, and many of these countries within the Soviet orbit are able to declare their independence, including Ukraine, the Baltic states, and so on. And so this means there are lots of Ashkenazi Jews, formerly refuseniks, or perhaps they had not even applied for exits, and now they have an opportunity to return to their ancient homeland, and you have this massive Operation Exodus that results in a huge wave of Soviet Ashkenazim to Israel, which in many ways changes the demographic balance and has lots of implications for Israel as well. So, rushing through this period, I'm basically ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We see that the Ashkenazim are really at the cusp of a new renaissance, both in terms of their newly adopted countries of residence here in the diaspora, in the Americas in particular, and especially in the land of Israel, where a large number of Ashkenazi Jews settled in the pre-state and then especially in the post-state era. But even in Europe itself, in Western Europe and in the territories of the former Soviet Union, you begin to see a renaissance of Jews beginning to rebuild their societies. We see it in institutions like the Ashkenazium that so graciously invited me to speak to you all over the course of these 12 lectures. We see it in numerous Chabad movements in particular that are active throughout the Soviet Union. We see it in my own institution, Turo University, that maintained a campus in Moscow and in Berlin, for example. We're all striving to rebuild that Jewish life that once was so strong and flourished in Ashkenazic lands. The Jews are a gregarious, irrepressible people that historically face challenges with energy and with humor and with an ability to reinvent themselves in order to meet the challenges of the era. I've been studying Jewish history now for about 30 odd years, and I still haven't figured out the secret sauce that allows them to surmount such tremendous challenges, especially after suffering such incredible losses as we have in the Holocaust. But nevertheless, it is a tremendous inspirational experience to track them through this millennial history. I want to thank you very much for staying with me with this very short version of this millennial history. And I hope that you will continue to study the history of this people. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to interact in other lectures. I want to thank the Ashkenazium finally for this very gracious invitation, and thank my Hungarian students who have been participating with me in the seminars following these lectures. So we have a few extra moments at this point for some questions and answers. I'm going to open up the Q&A for a larger discussion, but for those of you who wish to leave, please accept my thanks and my blessings, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to speak with each other in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. One of the most consequential rabbinic decisions that was made in all of Jewish history was undoubtedly Rabbeinu Gershom's famous ban on polygamy. I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at that decision, how it was made, and the impact that it had on Ashkenazi Jewry in particular. So this particular decision emerged from the city of Mainz, or Mayence, one of the really important heartland cities of early Ashkenaz. There are three cities that are very close to each other, really, towns, but by that context, I think cities would be the appropriate word. Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And this third one, Mainz, is where Rabbeinu Gershom had his yeshiva. He was originally from Metz in what we call today France, but he moved to Mainz at some point in his childhood, early adulthood, and that's where he made most of his reputation. Who is this Rabbeinu Gershom? Well, we know him primarily for the influence he had on later rabbis, and perhaps the most prominent of them is the great Rashi. Rashi was his intellectual grandson. He was the student of Rabbeinu Gershom's students. And in fact, it is Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the great biblical commentator, who gave him the title with which he is frequently referred to. And there's a passage in Rashi's writings in which he says, Rabbeinu Gershom, may the memory of the righteous and holy be for a blessing, who enlightened the eyes of the exile. So that phrase, enlighten the eyes of the exile, is translated as Me'or Lagola, the illuminator of the exile. And that's what Rabbeinu Gershom is called today. Rabbeinu Gershom, our Rabbi Gershom, the enlightener or the illuminator of the exile. And to continue the phrase, whom all Ashkenazi Jewry are the disciples of his disciple. Of course, that last phrase, disciples of his disciples, referring to Rashi's teacher, who was in turn Rabbeinu Gershom's student. Now, ironically, Rabbeinu Gershom's writings have not survived except in snippets of citations elsewhere. There are several commentaries printed on the Talmud that are attributed to him, but scholars believe that they were later attributions. They are not actually from his pen. Nevertheless, that does not diminish the tremendous impact of his teachings. His personal life, fascinating. He was born in Metz, as I mentioned earlier, around the year 960. We know only a few little bits of pieces of his biography. According to the Or Zarua, a very important Viennese commentator and halachist, his son Eliezer was forcibly converted to Christianity and then later killed, possibly in the context of some persecutions that occurred in the year 1012. We know that he was married at least twice. There are pieces of the text of his ketubah, his marriage contract, for his second wife, Bona, that is dated 1013. I'm wondering if those 2 years, the persecution of 1012 and the second marriage of 1013, suggest that perhaps they were related. Perhaps even he was widowed in the context of 1012. Simply don't know. On the left here, you can see a grave marker at Mainz, which has a few words of honorific. And then in the third line, you can see it says Rabbeinu or Reb Gershom. And so some believe that this is in fact a stone marking his grave, although that's disputed to a certain degree. Let's now talk about the bands themselves. What exactly were these bands? So first of all, the term used is not ban, but takana, or decree. And the root of the word takana in Hebrew means a repair, meaning like some kind of edict that's passed, that's designed to try and address some lacuna or some problem in society that needs some sort of legislative fix. And there are several that he was associated with, one of which is very significant, the Cherem HaYishuv, which is basically the ban on settlement, which essentially regulated the movement of Jews into new territories to minimize competition and allow Jews who were otherwise not allowed to enter guilds, for example, to protect their own industries from interlopers into their societies. A lot of wide-ranging impacts of that particular ban. But what's, I think, fascinating about the takanot that emerged out of Ashkenaz at this time is we should realize that, you know, this is a frontier society. This is a society where there are no major centers of Jewish activity that are older than 100 years or so. We have like scattered references to a few Jews here and there, but no major settlements. And the takanot represent the Ashkenazi Jews getting together. They would form these synods of rabbis who would come together from multiple communities, and they would decide on rules that would basically regulate their civilization. And it is in these early takanot that were issued 9th century, 10th century, 11th century in particular, where we begin to see the Jews attempting to regulate themselves to create that really impressive social service network that the Kehillah represented, the Jewish municipality represented, and would really flourish for the next 600 odd years. Really, really impressive things. So many of the takanot that are ascribed to Rabbeinu Gershom could very likely have come from his pen specifically, but more probably they are just the decisions of these rabbinical synods. And Rabbeinu Gershom may have been the most prominent of people among them. In later generations, a few hundred years later, giving weight to a takana by attributing it to Rabbeinu Gershom may have caused us to think of these bands as his alone, but they're more likely bands that were produced by an association of rabbis getting together and making decisions collectively. Other bands that issued from Rabbeinu Gershom and his synods were the ban on reading other people's correspondence, which you would think is like, well, doesn't that make sense? But in reality, there's no mitzvah, there's no specific commandment anywhere that says that, you know, if you receive a letter written by someone else addressed to a third person, that you're not allowed to open it and read it. You're not actually stealing anything from anyone. You are invading their privacy, but you're not actually encroaching on their property in any way, except perhaps intellectual property. Perhaps that's actually a separate body of law, hasagat gvul, that's related to the idea of moving boundaries. But at any rate, as you know, society was beginning to develop, and we're moving from a barter economy to a cash economy, and information is valuable. So that's when the synod in Ashkenaz said, under Rabbeinu Gershom, you know, just to be safe, we're going to make sure nobody is allowed to read each other's mail. Okay, lots of fascinating implications, by the way, for contemporary society, because information is even more available now and even more valuable now. And so the ban of Rabbeinu Gershom actually has a lot of relevance to privacy laws and communication today. But let's speak to the two related bans that are most centrally associated with Rabbeinu Gershom. The first is the ban on polygamy, and the second one, very closely related to it, is the ban on divorcing a woman against her will. So let's understand those. First of all, why a ban on polygamy? Anyone familiar with the first few books of the Bible know that polygamy is permitted in Judaism. Abraham had more than one wife. Jacob had multiple wives. King Solomon, King David, multiple wives all over the place. Polyandry, on the other hand, is forbidden, but polygamy is definitely part of the ancient Jewish tradition. And in fact, in Sephardic lands, it was maintained far longer than it was in Ashkenaz. So most scholars who look at this period think of it as a way of the rabbis in Ashkenaz relating to the Christian environment in which they were living. And to a large degree, this was, an emerging society. It was an increasingly religious society. We're not at the point where the church reaches its high point, its greatest power later in the 13th century. But nevertheless, this is a society where, unlike in Sephardic lands, in the Iberian Peninsula, south of Spain, the north of Africa, the Middle East, where polygamy was, considered normal, here polygamy is definitely looked down upon. There's also a notion of the increasing perception of the status of women, which may have spurred on this development. But it's clear that one of the major impetuses, I wonder if the plural of impetuses is impeti. I don't know. It sounds sort of good. But one of the major motivations for banning polygamy is because the increasing status of women in Christian society, where the idea of polygamy, of sharing a husband among several wives, is definitely not appreciated. Now, the other thing that goes with it is that Rabbeinu Gershom and his synagogue ruled that one could not marry multiple wives serially as well as in parallel, meaning not only can you not be married to two women at the same time living in the same house and things like that, but you also can't abandon one wife and then go and marry a second one and live singly with that other wife. The first wife will only accept the divorce and allow it to be to take effect that women had to consent to be divorced. Prior to this, the only